Okay, this video is all about the advantages and disadvantages of trade. Okay, so one big advantage of trade is it creates jobs. Basically, if an industry is able to export more of their goods because there's increased trade, therefore they're going to be producing more and therefore they're going to need to employ more. So this is obviously good for an economy. We also have the multiplier process. Let's take the example here of Rolls-Royce jet engines. If they're exporting more of their engines, this is mean they're going to be demanding more parts. Hopefully, some of those will be produced in the UK, and this is going to create jobs for the suppliers. And you've got the whole multiplier process. In other words, an initial injection in the economy, in this case, increased exports, will lead to a greater increase in national income. Notice the chain of reasoning there. We must remember that this employment increase is due to increased exports, and this idea of the export-led multiplier is really important in the UK at the moment. If we're going to continue to grow, we can't rely on debt-financed consumption as we have done in the past, and we can't rely on increases in government spending at the moment because obviously of government cutbacks because of the budget deficit. So this makes it really important to try and rebalance the economy and make sure exports play a greater contribution in the increase in aggregate demand. So there's some key evaluation there you should really be using in your exam. Okay, so here's an industry that's really benefited from increased trade, and that's the creative industries. So we're talking about things like film, television, music, software. I'm sure you'll recognise some of those images there, even I do. And if you just scroll down this BBC article, we can see that in 2012 it contributed over £70 billion to the UK economy, and actually made up 5.6% of all the people in the workforce. There's a demerit good. I'm sure you've never seen that before. And if you just scroll down, you can obviously pause this and read the whole article. Just gives you an idea here that nearly 1.7 million people are employed in the creative industries, and really shows how increased trade, exporting more and more software and music and film and TV, has really benefited the UK economy. Okay, the second big advantage of trade is it allows an economy to exploit comparative advantage. This is a very important theory, so if you're not clear on it, please watch the video on QE economics, which explains it very clearly. But in this instance, in the UK, a good example of an industry where we have a comparative advantage is in the financial sector. So therefore we're able to, as we're trading, we specialise in the production of these particular services, in this case insurance or banking or stockbroking, and this gives us a real economic advantage. Okay, so another advantage of trade is that it increases competition and therefore increases the contestability of a market. So obviously with increased trade over the last 20 or 30 years with countries like China, we've seen a huge increase in imported goods, whether it's clothing or electronic goods, and that means we as consumers are getting much cheaper products, and therefore our disposable income is going much further. So obviously that's good for us. It increases our consumer surplus. Another example is in the grocery sector in the UK. We've seen the growth of Aldi and Lidl, and this has helped to break some of the monopoly power of big supermarkets like Tesco, and obviously we as consumers benefit therefore from lower prices. Of course, there's a big downside here, of course, in terms of job losses in the UK because of this increased imports from overseas, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on when we talk about the disadvantages. Okay, another advantage of trade is that it gives the opportunity for British firms to export more of their goods, and therefore if they're exporting more, they're having to produce more, and this means they can achieve greater economies of scale. And obviously, just following that chain of reasoning through, we can talk about if there's greater economies of scale, their cost per unit of production should fall. And clearly, in theory, that should benefit us, the consumer, in terms of lower prices. Clearly, that's not always the case. So we've got two really good examples here. Dyson, obviously a very successful exporter of vacuum cleaners. And then we've also got the Scottish whisky industry, which clearly has seen huge increases in sales and therefore output, because they're able to export their drinks to other countries, especially those fast-growing economies such as China, etc. Okay, so let's move on to some of the disadvantages of trade. One of them is the idea of over-specialization. This is where a country perhaps becomes very reliant on a particular sector of the economy, and then something happens perhaps outside of their control, and this can cause significant impact on unemployment. One example in recent years is the financial services industry, largely based in London, following the 2007 credit crunch and 2008 recession and the downturn in the world economy. We certainly saw some significant job losses in the financial services sector, and this just showed how over-reliant we were perhaps on that sector, and therefore huge impact on the whole of the UK economy. Another example from perhaps a few years ago is South Wales' reliance and over-specialisation on things like coal mining. And then when we see a world decline in demand for coal from Wales, perhaps because of cheaper imports from, say, Poland, that has a significant impact on unemployment in that region. Okay, another disadvantage of trade is the infant industry argument, and certainly infant industry is a economic term that you need to try and get your head around. This is where an economy may be in the early stages of developing a particular industry, but this industry hasn't developed to the size required, and so it can't really compete with the larger industries in other countries, because its costs are much higher. So with trade, if there's a lot of trade, this means there's too much competition with these infant industries, and they're not really protected. So sometimes there may be an argument for protecting these industries through export subsidies or through tariffs until they become big enough to sort of fend for themselves. A really good example here is the sort of microchip industry in many Asian countries, who, if they weren't protected when they were first developing, would never have developed into the giants they are today. Okay, the final slide in this video is just to remind you of a few key terms: infant industry, comparative advantage, and the multiplier. Make sure you're very clear what they mean and add them to your key definition sheet. And the last but not least, make sure you now go on and watch the video on comparative and absolute advantage. I hope that you found this video useful, and you've got some good notes as a result.